All right, so if you're listening to this, you're probably the kind of person who likes to get right to the heart of things, the
Absolutely.
really big
It's a
questions.
foundation.
Yeah, the foundations. Well, that's exactly where we're headed today, deep into the realm of metaphysics.
Yeah, you could say we're going meta.
We are going meta, with a little help from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
A fantastic
It,
resource.
it really is. And I know our listeners, you all love to grapple with these complex ideas. So what we're aiming for in this deep dive, well, it's not just to regurgitate the encyclopedia entry. We want to unpack it, explore the nuances, the debates, the really fascinating parts of metaphysics, and do it in a way that hopefully sparks more questions than it answers.
Yeah, exactly. We want you, the listener, to walk away with a deeper understanding of this core area of philosophy. The methodology, the scope, the sheer variety of questions that fall under this umbrella of metaphysics.
So let's just dive right in. First question, the obvious one.
Mm.
What is metaphysics? Easy, right?
Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? But that's one of the first things the encyclopedia entry highlights, how tricky it is to pin down a precise definition.
Yeah, it's not like, say, ethics, where you've got a fairly well-defined set of problems.
Right, metaphysics has gone through a lot of shifts over time. Its subject matter has evolved.
Well, think about how the ancients viewed it. Folks like Aristotle, they were concerned with things like being as such, those first causes, those unchanging eternal things.
Right, and for them, that was pretty much it. But that kind of narrow definition just doesn't cut it anymore.
No, not at all. So how did we get from there to where we are now?
Well, a couple of really important things happened. I mean, the nature of metaphysical inquiry itself changed. Nowadays, you can engage in metaphysics just as much by denying those traditional subjects as by affirming them. Like Sartre said, denying the existence of God is just as much a metaphysical position as believing in God.
That's a good point, yeah. And on top of that, the whole landscape of philosophical inquiry shifted.
Right, especially around the 17th century. Questions that used to be considered part of physics, like free will or the mind-body problem, started getting pulled into the realm of metaphysics.
Makes sense. I mean, physics was becoming more and more, well, physics focused on measurement and laws and experiments.
Yeah.
But these big questions about change, about consciousness, about what it means to exist, they didn't really fit in there anymore.
Yeah, and the encyclopedia entry even suggests that the term ontology popped up as a way to specifically talk about the science of being as such, because metaphysics was becoming this catch-all term.
Oh, that's interesting. Like, people felt they needed to create a separate word just to hold on to that core idea of being.
Exactly. And there were attempts to categorize things further, like Christian Wolff dividing it into general metaphysics, that's your ontology, and then special metaphysics, which would cover things like the study of the soul, or even natural theology.
But even with all that categorizing, it still feels kind of messy, doesn't it? Like trying to herd cats.
Yeah, a little bit. And this is where things get especially interesting for philosophers, I think. I mean, if we can't define metaphysics by those original Aristotelian subjects, and it's become this broader, more inclusive field, what are we left with? How do we even characterize it today?
Well, the encyclopedia entry gives us a clue when it talks about contemporary anti-metaphysicians.
Right, and the point is that these folks don't necessarily deny the existence of metaphysical objects.
They just question the legitimacy of even asking those questions.
Exactly. And that gets to the heart of what metaphysics is really about. It's about that fundamental inquiry into the nature of reality, even questioning whether those inquiries are valid in the first place.
Like, metaphysics is the place where we ask what is real, and then immediately ask, but what does real even mean?
Yeah, and can we even know?
Exactly. All right, so even though the old metaphysics doesn't quite define the field anymore, those core questions are still there, right? That's what we have to start with.
Absolutely. And maybe the most fundamental of those questions is being as such. Just that phrase alone, it's like a whole philosophical treatise waiting to be written.
Yeah, being as such. I mean, what does it mean for something to be, to exist?
Well, a century shows how philosophers have tackled this from all sorts of angles.
You got Parmenides coming in strong with his being is, not being is not. Simple, bold.
Then you've got Avicenna arguing that essence precedes existence. A whole different ballgame.
And jump ahead to someone like Frege, a logician who comes along and says, affirmation of existence is just denying the number zero.
Totally different approaches to this fundamental question.
Right. And it's not just them. I mean, you have Anselm saying existence is a perfection. Then Kant comes along and says, being is not a real predicate. Like, two completely opposite views.
Exactly.
And then there's Russell, right? Talking about how universals have being but don't exist.
Right. And then Quine, famous for saying, to be is to be the value of a bound variable.
And even more recently, McDaniel, connecting an object's degree of being to the naturalness of its existence. It's mind-blowing to see how much philosophical thought has been dedicated to just this one concept.
It's really a microcosm of the history of philosophy itself, all focused on this idea of being.
And the interesting thing is the encyclopedia entry takes a pretty broad view of this. Even investigations into non-being, which sounds kind of paradoxical, are considered part of being as such, even though someone like Meinong might disagree.
Right, with his idea that predication is independent of being, but that just shows you how expansive this topic is.
All right, so next up we've got first causes and unchanging things. Those were huge for Aristotle, but it seems like their connection to being as such isn't as clear-cut in contemporary thought.
That's an important point. I mean, arguments for a first cause, like Aquinas' famous 5 ways.
Those are definitely still important in metaphysics.
Absolutely. But nowadays, denying the existence of a first cause or of unchanging things, those are seen as just as valid metaphysical positions.
It's all part of the inquiry.
Right. That's a key shift in modern metaphysics. It's not just about affirming things, but also about questioning and denying them.
Okay, now let's talk about categories of being and universals. This is where things start to get really interesting, I think. I mean, as humans, we just naturally want to categorize things, put them in boxes.
Absolutely. It's how we make sense of the world.
Right. So the encyclopedia entry raises this fundamental question. Is there a biggest box? A category of all things? And then what are the smaller boxes inside? Those ontological categories that kind of structure reality.
And that leads straight into the problem of universals.
Universals. These are those tricky things, those properties, qualities, attributes that seem to be shared by multiple individual things.
Like whiteness.
Whiteness, roundness.
Yeah, even things like, I don't know, War and Peace, the novel itself.
Well, the word horse. Is that a universal?
Well, that's part of the debate.
Right, the big debate between realists and nominalists. Do these universals exist as separate things, maybe in some Platonic realm?
Right.
Or are they just names, concepts we slap onto groups of things that happen to share some similarities?
And the entry makes a good point about how even nominalists have to grapple with the fact that the name itself, the concept, might be a kind of universal.
It's like you can't escape them.
It really gets you thinking about how we even conceptualize things.
Right. It's not just semantics. It's about the fundamental structure of reality, how we know things. And then the article goes on to connect these universals to those bigger ontological categories and subcategories.
Right. You've got your abstract objects, properties, and then you move down to those more concrete categories like dogs, chairs, you name it.
But here's where it gets even more complex. The problem of universals isn't just about whether they exist. It's about how they relate to those individual things, the particulars.
Yeah, how does this one white building over here, how does it participate in the universal of whiteness?
Right. Is it like a bundle of universals? Does it need some non-universal substrate to hang on to? Or is it just a bunch of individual property instances?
You know what they call tropes or accidents.
It's like we're trying to take reality apart and figure out what the pieces are and how they fit together.
And the entry emphasizes how any solution to the problem of universals has huge implications for our understanding of categories, of the structure of objects, even those categories that seem totally unrelated to universals.
Like propositions or events.
Right. They often still rely on some understanding of shared properties or relations.
So metaphysics, it's like this big puzzle, trying to figure out how all these different aspects of being and existence, how they all connect.
To create the reality we see and try to make sense of.
Exactly. Okay, so now we come to the concept of substance. This is another one that's been around for a while, right? It's this idea of things that exist in their own right, independently.
Right, as opposed to things that only exist in other things.
Like a smile or a hole.
Yeah, those need something to exist in.
Right. And this goes back to Aristotle's idea of proteiousiai, those primary beings.
For him, these were the fundamental building blocks, the things you can say things about, but that can't be said about other things. They have a definite identity, they're the bearers of properties, but they're not properties themselves.
And that question, whether substances exist and what they're like, that's still a big deal in metaphysics.
A huge question, and there's still no universally accepted answer.
Which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. The entry points out how even things we might normally consider substances, like events, or even stuff like water or iron.
They don't really fit the philosophical definition of substance.
So even our basic intuitions about what a substance is, those get challenged in metaphysics.
It makes you think twice about what you think you know.
It does. So we've got being as such, we've got first causes and unchanging things, we've got categories of being and universals, and now substance. These are all part of that old metaphysics, that foundation.
And they're still super relevant today. They inform so much of what's going on in contemporary metaphysics. But now we're moving into what we might call the new metaphysics, exploring other areas of reality.
The new frontiers. And first up, we've got modality. This is all about necessity, possibility, what must be, what could be, what can't be.
It's really about exploring all those different ways that reality could have been, could be, or has to be.
Right. And the encyclopedia entry makes a distinction between two types of modality, de dicto and de re. De dicto is about the necessity or possibility of propositions, statements.
Yeah, it's more about logic.
But de re modality, that's about the necessity or possibility of the properties or existence of things themselves. And that's definitely metaphysics.
It's about the modal properties that belong to objects and how they can change or stay the same across different scenarios.
So you have this idea of contingent existence, something could have not existed, versus necessary existence, something that has to exist. And then you have accidental properties, which a thing can lose without ceasing to be what it is, versus essential properties, those properties that make a thing what it is.
Yeah, like the example the entry uses, Sally, a person. Sally could have been born speaking French instead of English. That's an accidental property. But she's essentially not a poached egg. That's just part of what it means to be Sally.
It's a funny way to illustrate a pretty profound point.
And you've got philosophers like Quine who were really skeptical about modality, especially de re modality. He just didn't think it made sense.
But the entry credits Kripke and Plantinga with coming up with a really strong defense of de re modality by using this framework of possible worlds.
Not the kind of possible worlds that Leibniz was talking about, like possible creations by God. These are more like abstract, complete states of affairs, different ways reality could have been.
So a possible world is like a complete picture of everything that could be true.
Right, a maximal consistent set of propositions. And the actual world, well, that's just the possible world that happens to be true.
The one we live in.
Exactly. And this framework, it gives you a really powerful way to analyze those modal concepts, to talk about necessary truth, contingent existence, essential properties.
But then you're also kind of committing yourself to the existence of all these abstract possible worlds, right?
Which is where David Lewis comes in with his idea of modal realism.
Yeah, Lewis takes this idea of possible worlds and makes it even more radical.
Right. He says those possible worlds, they're not abstract, they're concrete.
They're real physical universes.
Spatiotemporally isolated, but just as real as the world we live in.
So for Lewis, our actual world, it's just one of countless real universes.
And the term actual, for him, it's just relative to where you are.
Because like actual just means here.
Exactly. And Lewis explains de re modality in terms of counterparts. So instead of saying that an object exists in multiple possible worlds, you say that it has counterparts in those other worlds, individuals who are similar enough to count as the same thing in a different context.
So essential properties are those properties that all your counterparts have, no matter what world they're in.
And this leads to a really interesting difference between the Kripke-Plantinga view and Lewis's view.
For Kripke and Plantinga, those modal concepts, they're just fundamental. You can't break them down further. But for Lewis, he's trying to reduce them to non-modal terms, like existence and similarity. It's like two totally different ways of looking at the same problem.
And it raises questions about the objectivity of de re modality. Because for Lewis, what counts as a counterpart is partly determined by our interests, which makes it seem a bit less, well, real in a way.
It's almost like a kind of anti-realism about modality.
Yeah, you could say that. But even with those differences, the encyclopedia entry makes a good point that both these frameworks show how much metaphysics is engaging with modality again. It's really a resurgence of this area of philosophy.
Okay, let's move on to another big one. Space and time. This seems like such a natural pairing, almost pre-philosophical.
Absolutely. It's just how we experience the world.
Right. And philosophers have recognized this connection for a long time, way before Einstein came along with his theory of relativity.
Like Kant, right. He saw space and time as the forms of our intuition.
The way we experience the world, the way our minds structure it. And the entry talks about all these parallel philosophical questions that come up for both space and time. Are they infinite or bounded? Can things be spatially or temporally unrelated? Are they substances themselves or just relations between things?
And it's interesting to compare those questions to the debates in modality.
Right, like substantivalism versus relationalism, that's like realism, versus nominalism for universals but for space and time.
It's these fundamental questions about what kinds of things exist and what their nature is.
But the entry also points out that time has its own unique set of challenges. Like, why is our experience of time asymmetrical? Why is the past so different from the future? And what about the feeling that time flows, that we're constantly moving through it?
Yeah, those are really tricky questions, and there don't seem to be any easy spatial analogs for them.
Right. And this leads us to that big debate between the A theories and B theories of time.
The A theories, they really emphasize that difference between past, present, and future.
Like McTaggart's A series,
Right, and some A theorists, like Pryor, they go so far as to say that the past and future don't really exist, only the present is real.
which is kind of similar to the idea of possible worlds where only the actual world is concrete.
Yeah, there's a connection there. And other atheists, even if they don't go that far, they still say that the present is somehow metaphysically special.
Whereas the B theorists, they just see time as this series of moments, all equally real.
With the only real distinction being earlier and later.
No flow, no special present moment.
Right. And it's interesting how some atheists actually use modal metaphysics to explain their views.
It all ties together.
It really does. And then you've got space, which shares some of those questions with time, but also has its own unique puzzles, like how many dimensions does space have? And what about those incongruent counterparts, like mirror images? They seem identical, but they're spatially different.
And that can lead to all sorts of weird questions about higher dimensions.
Right. Can there be more to space than we can perceive? And then beyond all those specific questions, you have this even bigger one. Are space and time even real?
I mean, Leibniz thought they were well-founded phenomena. Kant saw them as part of our minds, the way we structure our experience. And McTaggart famously argued that they're not real at all.
So even the reality of space and time is up for debate in metaphysics.
And as the entry points out, these questions about space and time, they're not isolated. They connect back to those older metaphysical problems.
Yeah. Like the idea of a first cause. If God is eternal and outside of space, what does that mean for the nature of time? What does omnipresence even mean if space isn't fundamental?
Right. And the status of universals, whether they exist anti-res or in rebus, that has implications for their relationship to space and time, too.
It's all interconnected.
Okay, now let's get into persistence and constitution. This is about how objects endure through time and how they're made up of parts. And this is where we get into some really brain-twisting thought experiments, like the statue and the lump of clay.
Oh yeah, the statue and the lump, that's a classic.
And Tib and Tibbles, the cat and its tail. These thought experiments, they really force you to think hard about identity and what makes something the same thing over time.
Right, like with the statue and the lump, they seem to occupy the same space at the same time, but you can argue they're not the same thing.
Because the lump could survive being squashed, but the statue wouldn't.
And that goes back to Leibniz's law. If two things are identical, they have to have all the same properties.
But then you run into this other problem. If they share all their properties at a particular moment, how can they be different?
Yeah, it's a real puzzle. And then you have Tib and Tibbles, the cat and its tail. Imagine you cut off the tail. You still have Tib, the cat, but is it still Tibbles?
They were spatially coincident before you cut off the tail, but now they have different parts.
And that's a challenge to the principle that if two things are discernible, they can't be identical.
Right, if you can tell them apart, they must be different. So how do we make sense of these cases?
Well, the encyclopedia entry talks about this idea of constitution. So you could say that the lump constitutes the statue, and Tib constitutes Tibbles.
It's like a special relationship, something more than just being part of something or being identical to it.
But not everyone agrees. Some philosophers think you can explain everything just in terms of parts and identity.
It's a really complex debate. But those thought experiments, they really expose how deep those questions about objects and persistence go.
Okay, moving on to causation, freedom, and determinism. Causation, that's another one of those concepts that goes way back in philosophy.
Yeah, but in modern metaphysics, the focus has been more on efficient causes, how things bring about change in the world.
And right away, you run into questions about what kinds of things can be causes. Is it events, states of affairs, substances? And can an absence be a cause?
Right, like can the lack of something cause something to happen?
Yeah, that gets debated. And then you have the question of whether causation is always between two things, or if it can involve more.
3 things, 4 things.
And is there such a thing as degrees of causation? Can one thing be more of a cause than another?
And even more fundamental, is causation even real, or can we reduce it to something else?
Like Hume thought, it's just constant conjunction, two things always happening together, but not actually causing each other.
And other philosophers have tried to explain it in terms of counterfactuals or laws of nature.
So lots of different views about causation out there. And then you can't talk about causation without talking about freedom and determinism.
That's the big one.
Right, especially with the rise of those deterministic views in the 17th century, fueled by advances in physics.
Like, if everything in the universe is governed by these deterministic laws,
Then how can we have free will?
that's the classic dilemma of free will. If determinism is true, then there are no real choices. Everything is predetermined. But if it's not true, then our actions are just random.
And then they're not really up to us either.
It's a tough nut to crack.
Yeah.
And even bringing in the idea of a soul, like Van Inwagen argued, that doesn't really solve the problem.
It just pushes it back a level.
So the real challenge is finding a way to understand free will that can make sense of all this, a way to reconcile freedom with the way the world seems to work.
Okay, now we're getting to the mental and physical. This is about the relationship between our minds and the physical world.
Our experiences, our thoughts, our feelings, versus those physical things out there.
And you've got the modern identity theory, which says that mental events and states, they're just identical to physical events and states.
It's a simple solution, but it kind of rubs a lot of people the wrong way.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like our minds are different from our brains.
Right. There's a real intuitive pull towards some kind of dualism, this idea that there are two kinds of things, mental and physical. And the entry talks about the big challenge for dualism, mental causation. How can a non-physical mind interact with the physical body?
It's like a ghost in a machine.
Right. If my thoughts can cause my arm to move, how does that happen without violating those basic laws of physics?
Like the conservation of energy.
And there have been all sorts of attempts to answer that question. Interactionism says that the mind and body just directly interact.
But that's kind of a mystery.
Right. How does that work? And then you have occasionalism, which says that God steps in every time there's an interaction.
Divine intervention all the time.
Which is a pretty big pill to swallow. And then there's pre-established harmony, the idea that everything is perfectly synchronized.
Like a cosmic clock.
But that raises all sorts of questions about free will and how this harmony even got set up in the first place.
And then you've got epiphenomenalism, which says that the mind is just a byproduct of the brain. It doesn't actually cause anything.
It's just along for the ride.
But that seems to contradict our experience of making choices, of our thoughts influencing our actions.
So dualism has its problems. And the entry then moves on to monistic views, particularly physicalism, which is basically the idea that everything is physical, there's no separate mental realm.
And it's the dominant view in philosophy today.
But even physicalism, it doesn't solve all the problems, like how can something physical be conscious?
Right. That's the hard problem of consciousness.
And then there are all these questions about how mental and physical properties relate to each other.
It gets back to those fundamental questions about what events and states and properties even are.
So even physicalism, it leads us back to metaphysics.
Yeah, it all comes back to metaphysics.
And then finally, we have social metaphysics. This is a newer area, but it's really taken off lately.
It's about the nature of the social world. Things like groups, institutions, social categories.
Like, what is a corporation, really? Or a sports team? What makes them real?
And what does it mean to say they're socially constructed? How is that different from being natural?
And the entry discusses all sorts of fascinating issues within social metaphysics, like how do we classify different social groups?
What's the relationship between individuals and those larger social entities?
And what about things like money, especially virtual currency, like Bitcoin? Is that real?
And then you have all the work being done on the metaphysics of race and gender.
What does it mean to be a woman or black or disabled? Are those natural categories or are they socially constructed?
In social metaphysics, it really challenges those traditional metaphysical assumptions about what counts as a fundamental entity. Can social things be fundamental?
Right, and that gets to the heart of what metaphysics is all about.
So after this whirlwind tour of metaphysics, the entry finally gets to a question that every philosopher has to grapple with: the methodology of metaphysics.
How do you actually do metaphysics? Especially when the claims are so far removed from everyday experience.
Right. It's not like we can just go out and observe a universal or a possible world.
So what are the rules of the game? How do you know if you're doing it right? And the entry talks about how this is especially important in modern metaphysics because it's so revisionary. Philosophers are challenging those traditional views, sometimes even denying the existence of things we normally take for granted.
Like composite objects.
Or saying that concrete possible worlds exist.
And those are pretty radical claims, so you need to be able to justify them.
And the entry discusses Quine's idea of connecting metaphysics to science.
Right. Quine thought you could figure out our ontological commitments by looking at our best scientific theories.
So if physics uses numbers,
then we're committed to the existence of numbers.
Makes sense. And that led to the Neo-Quinian program, which tries to ground those debates about abstract objects, mental events, and so on by looking at what's needed for our best scientific explanations.
But as the entry points out, not all metaphysical questions are just about what exists. Sometimes it's about those deeper explanatory relations.
Like what makes causation happen?
Or what's the fundamental nature of mental properties?
So you need a broader methodology to address those questions. And the entry talks about how metaphysicians are increasingly focusing on those explanatory relations,
Like Fine's theory of grounding.
where some facts are more basic, more fundamental, and they explain other facts.
And Schaeffer's idea of grounding for entities.
Maybe there are just a few fundamental entities that everything else is grounded in.
And Sider, he talks about metaphysics as trying to describe the world in terms of its fundamental structure.
Using a language that only refers to those fundamental things.
So these are just some of the ways that metaphysicians are approaching their work, trying to be rigorous, trying to find ways to justify their claims.
And all this methodology talk, it also allows us to critique those first-order metaphysical debates. Maybe some of those traditional problems, they're not really problems at all.
Maybe they're just conceptual confusions.
And now, the big question, the one that hangs over everything else. Is metaphysics even possible?
Right, because there's this long history of skepticism about metaphysics, going all the way back to Hume.
And the entry talks about two forms of this skepticism, the strong form and the weak form.
The strong form says that metaphysical statements are meaningless. They don't even make sense.
I like the logical positivists argued.
They thought that the meaning of a statement was its ability to make predictions about our experiences. And metaphysical statements, well, they don't do that.
But the logical positivists ran into their own problems.
Because their own statement about meaning, well, that didn't seem to have any empirical content either.
It was self-refuting.
And you see similar problems with some of the more recent metaphysical anti-realists. They try to undermine metaphysics, but their own arguments seem to rely on metaphysical assumptions.
It's hard to get away from metaphysics entirely.
It really is. And then you have the weak form of skepticism, which says that maybe metaphysical statements are meaningful, but we can't know the answers.
Like Kant argued, our minds are limited.
And more recently, you have McGinn, who argued that our evolutionary history might have shaped our minds in ways that make certain metaphysical questions permanently unanswerable.
So it's not that the questions are meaningless, it's that we're not equipped to answer them.
But the entry points out that those weak forms of skepticism, they often rely on pretty speculative claims about human cognition. We don't really know that we can't know.
So the question of whether metaphysics is possible, it's still an open question.
And that's kind of fitting, don't you think?
It is. So there you have it, a whirlwind tour of metaphysics. It's a vast and complex field, grappling with those fundamental questions that have puzzled philosophers for centuries. And as you've seen, it's not a static field. It's constantly evolving, expanding, pushing those boundaries of what we think we know about reality.
And for you, the listener who enjoys those deep philosophical questions, well, this is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore.
And that's what we love about metaphysics. It's not just about finding the answers. It's about the journey, the questioning, the constant pushing those limits of thought. So what do you think? Are there any particular areas of metaphysics that you find particularly intriguing? Or any particular problems that you keep coming back to? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And thanks for joining us on this deep dive.